30 minutes before my cancer surgery, my father smiled at me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years, slid a thick stack of papers across my hospital tray, and said, "It's just routine paperwork. Sign it before they take you in." If I had trusted him the way I used to, none of what happened afterward would have ever come to light. My name is Seraphina Vale. I'm 34 years old, and until that morning, I still believed that no matter how complicated my family had become, there was one line they would never cross. I was wrong. Looking back now, I don't think the diagnosis was the worst day of my life. Hearing the word, cancer, had terrified me. Of course. I spent nights wondering if I would survive, if I would ever design another building, or if I would see another Christmas. But fear has a strange way of clarifying what matters. While I was preparing for surgery, I wasn't thinking about money or inheritance. I was thinking about making it through the operation and going back to the life I had spent years building as an architect. I wanted another chance. My parents seemed supportive after my diagnosis, at least on the surface. My mother called more often than usual. My father even visited my apartment twice, something he hadn't done in months. I mistook that attention for concern. I didn't realize they were simply waiting for the right moment. My younger brother, Elliot, barely contacted me. That wasn't unusual. Elliot had always assumed the world would rearrange itself for his convenience. Somehow it usually did. Ever since we were children, there had been two different sets of rules inside our house. Elliot's mistakes were opportunities to learn. Mine were disappointments that reflected badly on the family. If he crashed a car, Dad said boys would be boys. If I came home with a 98 instead of 100, I was told I should have focused harder. I grew up believing that being the older sister meant carrying everyone else's burdens without complaining. My grandmother was the only person who ever questioned that. She used to squeeze my hand and whisper, "Don't confuse love with obligation, sweetheart." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Years later, those words became the reason I survived something far more dangerous than cancer. After Grandma passed away, she left me a beautiful piece of land outside the city. It wasn't the largest asset in the family, but it meant everything to me because it carried memories instead of dollar signs. We had planted trees there together every spring. She once told me she hoped I would build something meaningful there one day. My father never hid the fact that he disagreed with her decision. "Property like that should stay with the business," he would say. What he really meant was that it should eventually belong to Elliot. I refused every polite suggestion to transfer ownership. I thought that ended the conversation. Apparently, it only postponed it. The morning of my surgery, nurses moved efficiently around my room while I tried to calm my breathing. The surgeon had explained every step of the procedure the day before. I trusted my medical team completely. What I didn't expect was to spend my final half hour before anesthesia defending myself from my own family. My parents entered first. My mother carried flowers. My father carried a leather folder. Elliot walked in behind them wearing an expensive suit that looked newer than any concern on his face. Mom kissed my forehead. "You're going to be fine," she whispered. Dad placed the folder on the rolling table beside my bed. "Before they take you in," he said casually, "there are just a few documents we need to take care of." I looked at the folder. Hospital forms? Something like that. His answer came too quickly. Elliot leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. That alone made my stomach tighten. Elliot never came to hospitals unless there was something in it for him. Dad opened the folder and flipped to the signature page, already marked with yellow tabs. "Sign here, here, and here. It'll only take a minute." Something about the way he rushed me made me pause. "Can I read them first?" His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "There's no time, they're standard documents." I picked up the first page anyway. Within seconds, my heartbeat became louder than the heart monitor beside me. These weren't medical consent forms. They were corporate documents. The title referenced voting rights connected to shares held in my name. The second page mentioned transferring management authority under certain circumstances. The third referenced my inherited property. I looked up slowly. Why is my grandmother's land mentioned in hospital paperwork? Silence filled the room for a split second before Dad forced a laugh. It's only temporary. If something unexpected happens during surgery, Elliot can keep the company running without delays. The company already has a board. This is just easier. I kept turning pages. Every paragraph made things worse. Temporary authority could become permanent under broad conditions. Control over the land could be transferred through a trust amendment I had never approved. Hidden among legal language was a clause giving Elliot extraordinary decision-making power over assets that belonged solely to me. My hands started shaking, but not because of fear. Because I finally understood why everyone had suddenly become so attentive after my diagnosis. Mom reached for my arm. Orny, don't overthink this. We all agreed this is best. I stared at her. We all agreed. I wasn't even told this existed. Elliot finally spoke. Dad's trying to protect everything while you're dealing with this. He couldn't even say the word cancer. I looked directly at him. Protect everything, or protect you. His jaw tightened. Dad stepped closer. Seraphina, don't make this emotional. We have 20 minutes. That sentence changed something inside me. 20 minutes until doctors tried to save my life, and my father was worried about signatures. Not my surgery. Not my recovery. Signatures. I closed the folder carefully and pushed it back across the bed toward him. I'm not signing anything I haven't had my attorney review. His face hardened instantly. The kindness disappeared as though someone had switched off a light. If you refuse, he said quietly, whatever happens afterward will be your responsibility. I met his eyes for what felt like the first time in my life. No, I said. It'll be yours. At that exact moment, a nurse knocked gently before opening the door. Ms. Vale, she said, it's time. Dad didn't move. Neither did Elliot. For one long, suffocating second, nobody spoke. Then my father slowly picked up the folder, looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, and said, "You'll regret this." As the nurses rolled my bed toward the operating room, I watched my family standing silently in the doorway. I thought the hardest part of my day was about to begin. I had no idea the surgery would be the easiest battle I was about to fight. When I woke up after surgery, my first clear memory wasn't pain, it was silence. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of medical equipment and the distant footsteps of nurses changing shifts. My throat felt dry, my body heavy, and every movement reminded me that the operation had been real. A nurse smiled when she noticed I was awake. "The surgery went well?" she said gently. "The doctor will speak with you later today." Relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe I might actually have a future again. Then I looked around the room. There were no flowers, no balloons, no parents sitting in uncomfortable chairs pretending to read magazines, no younger brother checking his phone. The only visitor's chair beside my bed was empty. I tried convincing myself they had stepped out for coffee. Maybe visiting hours had ended. Maybe I was being unfair after everything that had happened before surgery. But as hours passed, that hope became harder to defend. Around noon my mother finally sent a text. "Rest. We'll come by when things settle down." There wasn't a single question about how I felt. No heart emoji. No, "I'm so glad you're okay." Just those 8 cold words. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. It wasn't the absence of affection that hurt the most. It was how familiar it felt. My family had always disappeared whenever I needed them most. Growing up, I learned to lower my expectations before they had the chance to disappoint me. When I was 12, I won a statewide art competition after spending months sketching every evening. The award ceremony happened on the same Saturday as one of Elliot's soccer tournaments. Dad didn't even hesitate. "Your brother's team needs support," he said while tightening Elliot's cleats. "They'll mail your certificate." Mom promised we'd celebrate another day. We never did. Years later, when I graduated at the top of my architecture program, Grandma sat in the front row clapping louder than anyone else. My parents arrived halfway through the ceremony because Elliot had forgotten to pay a speeding ticket and needed Dad's help before court. Even then, I smiled for family photos as though nothing was wrong. It became easier than asking why I always came second. Grandma used to notice anyway. After everyone left my graduation dinner, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was an old silver key. One day, she said, "This will open something that belongs only to you. Promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that your dreams belong to someone else." At the time I laughed because it sounded mysterious. She only smiled, looking back. I wonder if she had already seen the future my parents were trying to create. 3 days after surgery, I felt strong enough to check my work email. My inbox exploded with unread messages. Most were from colleagues wishing me a quick recovery. Then one subject line caught my attention: executive leadership transition. I opened it immediately. My stomach tightened as I read the announcement. Effective immediately. Elliot Vale would be assuming expanded operational responsibilities during my medical leave. That wasn't entirely unreasonable. What shocked me was the paragraph underneath. It referred to him acting with anticipated long-term authority over strategic assets. Strategic assets. That included projects I personally managed and property legally registered under my name. I called the company's legal department. The receptionist answered politely before transferring me to someone I'd never spoken with before. "I'm trying to understand this announcement," I said. "Who approved these changes?" There was an awkward pause. "Mr. Richard Vale instructed us to prepare transition documents several weeks ago." Several weeks. Not after my diagnosis. Before it. Before my surgery date had even been finalized. I thanked him and ended the call without saying another word. Suddenly, the leather folder in my hospital room looked very different in my memory. That wasn't a last-minute emergency decision. It had been planned carefully. Every page, every signature line, every reassuring smile. My father hadn't panicked about the future of the business. He had scheduled my illness into his succession plan. Later that afternoon, Elliot finally visited. He walked into my room wearing another expensive suit, carrying a coffee instead of flowers. "You look better," he said casually. "I almost didn't recognize you without arguing." I laughed once, though nothing felt funny. "You waited 3 days to visit," he shrugged. "Things have been busy." Busy taking over my work. He leaned against the windowsill without answering immediately. "Dad's trying to keep the company stable." "Stable or convenient," he sighed dramatically. "Seraphina, why do you always make everything personal?" I stared at him, wondering if he truly believed what he was saying. "You tried to get me to sign away my voting rights 30 minutes before surgery. You weren't signing them away. Then why didn't anyone let me read the documents in advance?" He looked away. That tiny hesitation told me more than any confession could have. "You always overanalyze everything," he muttered. "Dad knew you'd never agree." There it was, not a denial, an admission wrapped inside an excuse. They knew I would refuse if I had a real choice. That's why they waited until I was frightened, medicated, and about to be wheeled into an operating room. "Was this your idea?" I asked quietly. Elliot shook his head. "Dad believes the company needs one leader. And somehow that's always you. Because someone has to make hard decisions." I almost smiled. Elliot had never completed a project on time in his life. Half the developments he claimed credit for had been cleaned up by my team behind the scenes. Hard decisions weren't his specialty. Being protected from consequences was. Before leaving, he stopped at the door. Dad said something else. I looked at him without speaking. "If you'd just signed, none of this would have become so complicated." The door closed behind him. I sat there for several minutes replaying that sentence. None of this would have become complicated. They weren't worried about my recovery. They were frustrated that I had interrupted their plan. That evening my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another insurance representative. Instead, a calm older woman's voice introduced herself. "Seraphina, this is Margaret Holloway." I recognized the name immediately. Margaret had been my grandmother's attorney for over 20 years. I hadn't spoken to her since Grandma's funeral. "I've been trying to reach you," she continued. "I heard about your surgery." I'm relieved you're recovering. Thank you. She paused before lowering her voice. Your grandmother left instructions that I was only allowed to discuss under very specific circumstances. My heart skipped. What kind of circumstances? I think, she said carefully, those circumstances have just occurred. Every instinct told me this conversation mattered. Can you come to my office when your doctor clears you to leave the hospital? Is this about the property? Another pause. It's about much more than the property. Before hanging up, Margaret added one final sentence that stayed with me long after the call ended. Your grandmother expected someone would eventually ask you to sign something you shouldn't. I slowly lowered the phone, realizing the woman who knew me best had somehow anticipated the betrayal I had only just begun to understand. The hardest part of recovering from surgery wasn't learning to walk the hospital hallway again. It was realizing that while I had been fighting to stay alive, my family had quietly started erasing me from the life I had spent 15 years building. 2 days after Margaret called, my surgeon approved my discharge with strict instructions to rest for several weeks. My best friend, Claire, insisted on driving me home because she refused to let me call my parents. If they cared enough to pressure you before surgery, she said as she helped me into her car, they can live with missing your ride home. I didn't argue. Deep down, I knew she was right. My apartment felt strangely unfamiliar after nearly a week away. Someone had watered my plants, and I assumed Claire had done it, but otherwise everything was exactly where I had left it. The silence should have been comforting. Instead, it gave my thoughts too much room to wander. I kept replaying the look on my father's face after I refused to sign. It hadn't been disappointment, it had been calculation, as though he were already adjusting his next move. The following morning, I opened my laptop determined to catch up on emails from my architecture firm. I expected hundreds of messages about deadlines and clients. Instead, the first notification froze me in place. My employee login had been disabled. I refreshed the page twice, thinking it was a technical problem. Then I tried again from my phone. The same message appeared. Access restricted. Please contact administration. My stomach tightened. I called the company's IT department. The technician verified my identity before sounding increasingly uncomfortable. Vale, he said carefully. We received authorization from executive management to suspend your administrative privileges during your leave. Executive management. I repeated. Who signed that authorization? There was a long silence before he answered. Mr. Richard Vale. I thanked him politely, although my hands were shaking by the time I ended the call. My father wasn't even employed by the firm anymore. He had stepped away from daily operations years earlier when outside investors joined the company. He still owned shares, but he didn't have authority to remove me from my own projects without board approval, unless someone had convinced the board that I would never return. That possibility made me feel colder than any hospital room ever had. Before I could gather my thoughts, another email arrived from a colleague I trusted. The subject line read, "Simply call me." I dialed immediately. "Seraphina," Daniel answered, lowering his voice. "I shouldn't even be calling you from the office." "What's happening?" "Richard has been here almost every day." My chest tightened. Doing what? Meeting privately with board members, introducing Elliot to clients, telling everyone the company needs stable leadership because your future is uncertain. He hesitated before continuing. "Some people think you decided to step away voluntarily." I closed my eyes. I never said anything like that. I know. But they're moving fast. After hanging up, I sat motionless for several minutes. My father wasn't simply preparing for the possibility that surgery might go badly. He was actively rewriting the story while I was still recovering. By lunchtime, I decided hiding at home wouldn't solve anything. I called the company's headquarters and requested a meeting with human resources. The woman on the phone sounded nervous. "I'm sorry," she said, "but all executive meetings are currently being handled by Mr. Elliot Vale." Hearing those words out loud felt surreal. Elliot couldn't even read a construction budget without asking for help 6 months earlier. Yet somehow he was suddenly overseeing executive decisions. I drove to the office anyway. Walking through the lobby felt like entering someone else's building. People smiled awkwardly before quickly looking away. A few employees hugged me and asked how I was feeling, but others seemed afraid to be seen talking to me. Rumors spread quickly in professional environments. Apparently, so did loyalty. When I reached my office on the 4th floor, my access card wouldn't unlock the door. I stood there staring at the blinking red light until a familiar voice spoke behind me. "You weren't supposed to come in today." I turned around and found Elliot holding a leather portfolio, looking almost amused. "Apparently I'm not supposed to enter my own office either." He glanced at the card reader. "Temporary security update. Temporary until everything settles." I folded my arms carefully, trying not to strain my healing incision. "What exactly is everything?" Elliot sighed dramatically. "Dad knew this would upset you." "Answer the question." He looked around to make sure no one else was nearby before lowering his voice. "The board needs certainty. Investors don't like uncertainty." "So you told them I'm finished?" "We told them you're focusing on recovery." Without asking me, he didn't deny it. Instead, he unlocked my office with his own card. The room looked almost untouched, except for one detail that immediately caught my attention. The framed architectural drawings that had hung behind my desk for years were gone. In their place sat a large company organizational chart listing Elliot as interim executive director. My name appeared several lines lower under a section labeled medical leave status pending review. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "Who approved this?" I asked quietly. "The board." "Based on what?" Elliot shrugged. "Based on reality." Reality. My voice cracked despite my efforts to stay calm. The reality where I survived surgery. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. No one expected. He stopped speaking too late. I stared at him. "Finish that sentence. I didn't mean it like that. Didn't you?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, Dad was preparing for every possibility, including the possibility that I wouldn't come home." He said nothing. That silence answered every question I still had. My father hadn't built a contingency plan, he had built an opportunity. Before leaving the office, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and removed the only personal item still inside. A faded photograph of my grandmother standing beside me on the empty piece of land she had left me. We were both covered in dirt after planting young oak trees, laughing at something neither of us could remember now. On the back, written in her neat handwriting, were 7 words. "Some roots survive even the harshest winters." I slipped the photograph into my bag just as my phone rang again. Margaret Holloway. "I have something you need to see," she said without any greeting. "Can you come this afternoon?" "I can." Her voice grew even more serious. "Bring every document your family asked you to sign." "I still have copies?" "Good," she replied. Because I believe those papers were only one piece of a much larger plan. As I ended the call, I glanced once more at the organizational chart hanging in my former office. Elliot smiled confidently from across the room, convinced he had already inherited the future. Neither he nor my father realized that somewhere inside Margaret's office was information my grandmother had protected for years. Information that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Margaret Holloway's office hadn't changed since the day of my grandmother's funeral. The walls were still lined with dark wooden bookshelves. The windows still overlooked the courthouse square, and the old brass clock still ticked loudly enough to make silence feel heavier. As soon as I walked in, Margaret stood, embraced me gently, and held my shoulders for a moment. "Your grandmother would be relieved to see you standing," she said softly. I smiled, but it faded almost immediately. "I don't think she'd be surprised by what my family has done." Margaret sighed. "No." She motioned for me to sit across from her conference table. "She wouldn't." That answer stopped me. For years I had assumed Grandma simply disagreed with my father's opinions. I had never imagined she actually expected him to betray me. Margaret placed a thick archival box on the table. It looked older than I remembered, sealed with faded legal tape and labeled in my grandmother's handwriting. Across the front, in neat cursive, were 6 words: open only if Seraphina is pressured. My pulse quickened. She wrote this. Margaret nodded. 8 years ago. I stared at the box without touching it. 8 years. She amended her estate plan shortly after a series of meetings with your father. Meetings about what? Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses and folded her hands. Your father wanted her to restructure the inheritance. He argued that family assets should remain under one decision maker. I almost laughed, meaning Elliot. Meaning whoever he believed he could control. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Margaret carefully opened the box and removed several folders organized by date. Every document had my grandmother's signature. Every page had been professionally notarized. There was nothing emotional or dramatic about them. They were calm, methodical, and frighteningly thorough. Grandma hadn't reacted impulsively. She had prepared. Margaret slid one folder toward me. Read the first letter. I unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. My dearest Seraphina, if you're reading this, someone has asked you to sign something when you were too frightened, too sick, or too overwhelmed to make a truly free decision. I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm right, remember this before you remember anything else. Love never demands urgency when honesty can wait. I had to stop reading because my eyes blurred with tears. Margaret quietly handed me a tissue but didn't interrupt. After taking a slow breath, Your father believes strength comes from control. He has believed that for many years. I tried to change his mind. I could not. So I changed my estate plan instead. I looked up. She knew. Margaret nodded once. She knew enough. The next folder contained legal amendments to the family trust. Margaret turned directly to one highlighted section. This is the clause I wanted you to see. The language was precise. If any beneficiary or family member attempted to obtain property transfers, management authority, voting rights, or ownership interests from me while I was under significant medical treatment, heavy medication, or facing a life-threatening diagnosis through coercion, deception, or undue pressure, that individual would automatically lose any administrative authority connected to Grandma's trust. Independent trustees would immediately assume control pending judicial review. I read the paragraph 3 times before fully understanding it. She created this specifically for me. Yes. Why didn't she tell me? Margaret smiled sadly. Because she hoped it would never be necessary. My chest tightened. Grandma had spent years protecting me from a danger I never believed could come from inside my own family. Margaret opened another folder. There's something else. This one contained correspondence between her office and my father from years earlier. None of the letters were hostile. In fact, my father sounded polite throughout them, but the requests were unmistakable. He repeatedly argued that keeping valuable assets divided among family members would weaken future business growth. He suggested transferring management authority to a centralized structure led by the family's natural successor. Every proposal ended with Elliot's name. Every request had been denied. He never stopped trying, Margaret said quietly. After each rejection, he simply changed tactics. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. So this didn't begin with my diagnosis. No. It didn't begin with Grandma's death either. No. She folded her hands again. Seraphina, your father has been trying to consolidate those assets for almost a decade. A decade. My illness hadn't created his plan. It had simply created the opportunity he thought he needed. Anger rose inside me, but it wasn't the explosive kind. It was colder than that. Clearer. Suddenly all the awkward conversations over the years made sense. Every suggestion that I let Elliot gain experience managing my property. Every comment that my projects should be supervised by family. Every holiday discussion about keeping everything together. They hadn't been casual conversations. They had been rehearsals. Margaret slid one final envelope across the table. This was to be delivered only if the protective clause became relevant. Inside was a handwritten note from Grandma. It was only a few lines long. If someone has ignored your voice, don't shout louder, gather the truth. Truth is patient, greed never is. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. She had never believed in revenge fueled by anger. She believed that people usually destroyed themselves if given enough time. "What do we do now?" I asked. Margaret's expression changed from sympathetic to professional. "No, we prove what happened." She opened a legal notebook and began making a list. "First, we obtain the complete surveillance footage from the hospital hallway outside your room." Would they still have it? Hospitals retain recordings for a limited period. We need to move quickly. She wrote another note. "Second, we request every visitor log from the day of your surgery. To prove my family was there. To establish timing." She looked directly at me. "Timing matters because your father insisted you sign minutes before anesthesia. That's exactly the situation your grandmother anticipated." The list kept growing. Medical records, phone logs, corporate emails, draft versions of the documents my father had brought to the hospital. Then Margaret paused. "One more thing." "What?" "Who was your attending oncologist?" "Dr. Naomi Brooks." Margaret nodded slowly. "If she witnessed any attempt to pressure you before surgery, her testimony could become extremely important." I remembered something I hadn't thought about since that morning. Just before the nurses wheeled me toward the operating room, Dr. Brooks had walked into my room and frowned when she saw the papers spread across my bed. At the time, I assumed she was simply checking on me. Now, I wondered if she had noticed much more than that. As I left Margaret's office carrying copies of the trust documents, my phone buzzed with a notification from the company's internal news feed. Someone had leaked photographs of Elliot touring one of my largest development projects with investors. The headline beneath the pictures read, "Vale Development enters a new era of leadership." I looked at Elliot smiling confidently for the cameras and felt something unexpected. Not fear, not jealousy, certainty. He believed the future already belonged to him. Neither he nor my father understood that my grandmother had quietly designed a future where their greatest mistake wouldn't be trying to steal from me. Their greatest mistake would be trying to do it while leaving behind evidence. By the time I reached my apartment that evening, I realized something had shifted inside me. For the first time since my diagnosis, I wasn't thinking like a frightened patient anymore. I was thinking like an architect. My entire career had been built around solving complicated problems by studying every detail before making the first move. My father believed emotion would make me reckless. He forgot that patience had always been my greatest strength. The next morning, Margaret arrived with 2 large binders, a laptop, and a legal assistant named Owen. My dining table disappeared beneath documents within minutes. "We're not trying to prove your father is selfish," Margaret said, as she organized folders by date. "Courts don't punish selfishness. They punish actions." I nodded. "Then we prove the actions." She smiled slightly. "Exactly. We started with the paperwork my father had brought to the hospital." Margaret compared every page with corporate filings already registered with the state. It didn't take long before Owen looked up from his laptop. "These weren't drafted last minute," he said. "The metadata shows multiple revisions over nearly 4 months." I leaned forward. 4 months? The earliest draft was created almost a month before your biopsy results confirmed cancer. A chill ran through my body. Dad hadn't reacted to my illness. He had been preparing long before anyone knew how serious my condition would become. Margaret quietly made another note. "That shows planning." It was only the first piece of the puzzle. We requested copies of visitor records from the hospital. Fortunately, Margaret knew the hospital's legal counsel from previous estate cases. By the following afternoon, they confirmed exactly what we needed. Richard, Linda, and Elliot had entered my room 33 minutes before anesthesia. They had remained inside until the surgical team arrived. Their arrival and departure times matched perfectly with my grandmother's protective clause. "Good," Margaret said. "Now we establish what happened during those 33 minutes. The camera recorded inside the room." I asked hopefully. She shook her head. "Patient rooms don't. Hallways do." At first I felt disappointed. Then she continued, "Sometimes hallway footage is even more valuable." 2 days later, We sat inside a secure viewing room at the hospital's administration building. A compliance officer loaded the surveillance recording onto a monitor. The footage showed my family entering my room carrying the leather folder. 27 minutes later, a nurse approached the door but hesitated before entering. She seemed to hear raised voices inside. Several seconds later, Naomi Brooks appeared from the opposite hallway. She spoke briefly with the nurse before both entered my room together. I stared at the screen. "I don't remember that. You were under enormous stress," Margaret reminded me. The video continued. Less than 2 minutes later, my father exited the room, holding the folder tightly against his chest. His expression wasn't calm. He looked angry. Elliot followed behind him, speaking rapidly while my mother wiped tears from her face. "Pause there," Margaret said. She pointed toward the timestamp. "Your father left carrying unsigned documents immediately before surgery." She looked at me. "That supports your version of events." It wasn't dramatic evidence. There was no audio, no confession. But facts didn't need dramatic music. They simply needed consistency. Afterward, Margaret arranged a meeting with Dr. Brooks. I hadn't seen my surgeon since my final follow-up appointment, and walking back into her office felt strangely emotional. She smiled warmly. "You're healing beautifully," she said before noticing Margaret beside me. "I assume this isn't only a medical visit." "No," I admitted. "It's about what happened before surgery." Jack Brooks became noticeably serious. Margaret explained the situation without exaggeration. She never once accused my father of crimes. She simply described the timeline and asked whether the doctor remembered anything unusual that morning. Dr. Brooks didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened my medical chart on her computer. "I documented something," she said quietly. She scrolled through several pages before turning the monitor toward us. There, in her own clinical notes, written before my operation, was a sentence that made my heart race. "Patient appeared emotionally distressed due to ongoing family discussion involving legal documents immediately prior to transport. Recommended postponing all non-medical decision making until after recovery." I looked at her in disbelief. "You wrote that?" "Yes." "Why?" She folded her hands calmly. "Because patients facing major surgery should never be pressured into signing legal agreements. When I entered your room, it was obvious something unrelated to your treatment was happening." I felt tears sting my eyes again, not because of sadness this time, but because someone had actually seen what my family was doing. Someone outside my own memories had recognized it was wrong. "Would you be willing to testify if necessary?" Margaret asked. Dr. Brooks answered without hesitation. "If the court asks me to explain my medical observations, absolutely." As we left the hospital, Margaret finally allowed herself a small smile. "Your father expected this to become one person's word against another's," she said. "Instead, we now have independent medical documentation." It felt like breathing fresh air after weeks trapped underwater. But every time hope appeared, my family found another way to test it. 3 mornings later, I received official court documents delivered by certified mail. The envelope contained a petition filed by Richard Vale. I read the title twice before my brain accepted the words. "Petition for appointment of temporary conservator." My father was asking a judge to declare that I was temporarily incapable of managing my financial affairs because of my recent medical condition. If approved, someone else would receive legal authority over major financial decisions while I recovered. I already knew who that someone would be. My phone rang less than 5 minutes later. Richard's name appeared on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "You should have listened before things became public," he said calmly. "You actually filed this. It's only temporary, just like the papers in my hospital room." He ignored the question. "You're recovering from cancer. The court will understand you need help." "I don't need help. I need my father to stop trying to take my life apart." His voice hardened. "I'm trying to protect this family." I took a slow breath before answering. "No, you're trying to protect your plan." There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "Well, let the judge decide." The line disconnected. I lowered the phone and looked toward Margaret. who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. Instead of looking worried, she calmly reached into her briefcase and removed another folder. "Good," she said. "No, we know exactly how far he's willing to go." She placed the petition beside the surveillance records, the doctor's notes, and the trust documents. Piece by piece, the picture had become unmistakably clear. My father believed he was tightening his grip around my future. What he couldn't see was that every new move gave us another piece of evidence. And somewhere, hidden inside the strategy he thought was brilliant, was the mistake that would eventually bring the entire plan crashing down. If you had walked into my father's office that week, you would have believed he had already won. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who thought every obstacle had been removed. Investors were shaking his hand again. Elliot was sitting in executive meetings that had once been mine. Even my mother's forced smile had returned because, in her mind, the family business was finally safe. What none of them understood was that people become careless when they think the game is over. And careless people leave evidence everywhere. Margaret advised me not to respond publicly to the conservatorship petition. Every instinct told me to defend myself immediately, but she stopped me before I could even draft a statement. "Silence isn't surrender," she reminded me. "Right now they're building assumptions. Let them." It was harder than I expected. Every day another rumor appeared. Former clients sent polite emails asking whether I planned to retire permanently. A local business journal published a short article describing Elliot as the next generation of leadership at Vale Development. They even used a photograph of him standing in front of one of my award-winning projects. I almost laughed when I saw it because I remembered that day clearly. Elliot had shown up 15 minutes before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, taken pictures with reporters, and left before the speeches were over. He hadn't contributed a single design decision to that project, yet now he was presenting it as proof of his leadership. Claire sat across from me in my apartment, reading the article with obvious disgust. "Do you want me to call the editor?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, you're just going to let them lie." "For now." She looked unconvinced. "This doesn't sound like you." "Hoot isn't," I admitted. "But Margaret keeps saying they're making mistakes faster than we are." Claire folded the magazine closed. "I really hope she's right." She was. 2 days later, Margaret invited me to another meeting. This time Owen already had several files spread across the conference table when I arrived. He looked more excited than usual. "We found something," he said before I even sat down. Margaret slid a printed email toward me. It had been obtained through discovery after my father filed the conservatorship petition. The message had been sent from Richard to several board members nearly 3 weeks before my surgery. The subject line read continuity planning. At first glance, it looked harmless. But halfway through the email was one sentence that immediately caught my attention. "Once Seraphina's transition is finalized, Elliot will assume full operational authority without interruption." I read it twice. "Transition?" I asked quietly. "Not recovery." Margaret nodded. "Words matter." She pointed at the sentence. It didn't describe temporary medical leave. He described permanent replacement. My father had accidentally revealed what his real objective had been all along. He hadn't been preparing for uncertainty. He had been planning for my absence. Owen opened another folder. "There's more." Several meeting minutes from board discussions showed Richard repeatedly encouraging directors to approve emergency restructuring before my surgery. One independent board member had written handwritten notes questioning why such urgent action couldn't wait until after my recovery. That board members' concerns had been ignored. "Who wrote these?" I asked. "Benjamin Ortiz," Owen replied. "One of the independent directors." Margaret smiled slightly. "We're meeting him tomorrow." The next afternoon Benjamin turned out to be nothing like I expected. He was in his early 60s, soft-spoken and clearly uncomfortable with conflict. After introducing himself, he apologized before I even asked a question. "I should have pushed harder," he admitted. "At the time Richard insisted everything had already been discussed with you." I stared at him. He told the board I had approved the restructuring. Benjamin nodded slowly. Said you wanted the transition handled privately because of your health. My chest tightened. That never happened. I know that now. He looked genuinely ashamed. When the conservatorship petition became public, I started asking questions. Things stopped adding up. He reached into his briefcase and handed Margaret another document. This was never included in the official meeting minutes. It was a personal notebook page Benjamin had written during one executive session. Next to my father's name were 6 words underlined twice. Move quickly before she changes her mind. My pulse quickened. He actually said that? Benjamin nodded. Word for word. Margaret carefully placed the note inside a protective folder. Would you be willing to testify? Benjamin didn't hesitate. Yes, walking out of that meeting. I finally understood what Margaret had meant about patience. My father believed controlling the narrative meant controlling the truth. But every person he pressured remembered something slightly different. Every shortcut created another witness. Every lie required another lie to protect it. Meanwhile, Richard and Elliot continued behaving as though nothing could touch them. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned they had already begun discussing long-term expansion plans. Elliot was interviewing candidates for management positions that technically still reported to me. Richard had even started introducing his son to investors as the future of the company. The arrogance almost made me smile. They weren't preparing a defense because they couldn't imagine needing one. Then something happened that none of us expected. Margaret received a phone call from the hospital's compliance office. We found additional security footage. The administrator explained. Apparently another hallway camera covered the corridor leading toward the elevators outside my hospital room. The recording showed my father and Elliot leaving after I refused to sign. There was still no audio, but their body language spoke volumes. Richard slammed the folder against the wall hard enough that loose papers scattered across the floor. Elliot quickly gathered them, while my mother stood several feet away crying. A hospital employee eventually helped collect the documents before handing them back to my father. That's significant, Margaret said after watching the video. Not because of the anger. I looked at her confused. Then why? She replayed one specific moment. As the employee picked up the papers, one page flipped over just long enough for the camera to capture the bold title printed across the top. Transfer of controlling voting interests. Even though the rest of the text couldn't be read, the title alone contradicted my father's later claim that the folder contained only precautionary administrative forms. He said these were routine documents. I whispered. No, we can prove they weren't. Margaret nodded. Exactly. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could almost see the finish line. But experience had taught me that people like my father rarely admitted defeat gracefully. That evening, another message arrived from the court. The hearing date had been officially scheduled in less than 2 weeks. A judge would decide whether I was capable of controlling my own future, or whether my father would be handed the authority he had been chasing for years. I looked at the notice in silence before setting it down beside my grandmother's photograph. It's almost time, I whispered. And somewhere across town, completely unaware of how quickly the walls were closing around him, Richard Vale was probably celebrating a victory he no longer had. The morning of the hearing felt strangely peaceful. After weeks of gathering evidence, reviewing documents, and preparing for every possible argument, there was finally nothing left to collect. All that remained was the truth. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the last button of a navy blue blazer I hadn't worn since before my diagnosis. The jacket fit a little looser now after surgery, but that hardly mattered. The woman staring back at me wasn't the frightened patient who had been wheeled into an operating room 6 weeks earlier. She looked tired. She still carried healing scars beneath her clothes, but she also looked certain. Claire drove me to the courthouse because Margaret insisted I shouldn't arrive alone. Nervous? Claire asked as we parked. I smiled honestly. Little. Good. She squeezed my shoulder. It means this matters. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already waiting. Apparently, word had spread that a dispute involving one of the city's oldest family development companies was finally reaching a courtroom. Camera flashes followed my father and Elliot as they stepped from a black sedan. Richard looked confident, wearing the same tailored charcoal suit he always chose for important business meetings. Elliot walked half a step behind him, smiling politely for photographers as though this were a company announcement rather than a family dispute. My mother followed quietly, avoiding every camera. When Richard saw me walking toward the entrance beside Margaret, his smile disappeared for just a moment before returning. "Good morning, Seraphina," he said calmly. "You still have time to settle this privately." I looked at him without anger. "You had plenty of chances to settle this before you brought papers into my hospital room." His jaw tightened. "Those documents were misunderstood," Margaret answered before I could. "Fortunately, misunderstandings can be clarified with evidence." Richard didn't respond. He simply turned and walked into the courthouse. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Representatives from the company sat behind Richard. Several board members, including Benjamin Ortiz, occupied another row. Claire sat quietly behind me, while Margaret organized binders with the calm precision I had come to admire. When the judge entered, every conversation stopped immediately. After opening statements, Richard's attorney stood first. He painted a picture of a concerned father trying to protect family assets while his daughter recovered from serious illness. He repeatedly emphasized words like temporary, stability, and responsibility. Listening to him, you would have believed Richard had sacrificed everything for me. I almost admired how convincing it sounded. Almost. Then it was Margaret's turn. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't accuse anyone of greed. She simply stood, adjusted her glasses, and said, "Your Honor, this case is not about a father protecting his daughter. It is about a father attempting to obtain legal authority from his daughter at the exact moment she was least capable of making independent decisions." The first witness was Dr. Naomi Brooks. She walked confidently to the witness stand and answered every question with the calm professionalism that had reassured me before surgery. Margaret asked, "Doctor, when you entered Vale's hospital room prior to surgery, what did you observe?" "I observed legal documents spread across the patient's bed," Dr. Brooks replied. Ms. Vale appeared visibly distressed. Her family was discussing those documents immediately before anesthesia. "Did that concern you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because patients facing major surgery should not be pressured into making significant legal or financial decisions. I documented my concerns in the medical record that same morning." Margaret handed the judge a certified copy of the medical notes. Richard's attorney stood for cross-examination. "Doctor, you cannot say what was actually discussed inside that room, can you?" Dr. Brooks remained composed. "I can testify to what I personally observed as a physician. The patient was under emotional distress because of legal paperwork unrelated to her medical treatment." "But you don't know whether anyone pressured her." "I know enough to recommend that all legal decisions be postponed." Her answer landed exactly where it needed to. Calm, professional, impossible to dismiss. Next came the hospital compliance officer, who authenticated the surveillance footage. The courtroom lights dimmed as the video played across the large screen. Everyone watched Richard, Linda, and Elliot enter my hospital room carrying the leather folder. Minutes later, the recording showed nurses hesitating outside the door before Dr. Brooks entered. Then came the moment I had watched several times already. Richard stormed into the hallway, gripping the folder tightly after I refused to sign. The second camera recording followed immediately afterward. Gasps spread quietly through the courtroom as Richard slammed the folder against the hallway wall. Loose papers scattered across the floor. A hospital employee helped gather them, briefly exposing the title printed across one-page transfer of controlling voting interests. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His attorney objected, arguing the title alone proved nothing. The judge overruled the objection, allowing the footage to remain part of the record. Margaret then called Benjamin Ortiz. He described the executive meetings held before my surgery and confirmed that Richard repeatedly referred to my transition, not my recovery. Finally, Benjamin produced his handwritten meeting notes. Margaret asked only one question. Mr. Ortiz, what did Richard Vale say during that meeting? Benjamin looked directly toward the judge before answering. He said, move quickly before she changes her mind. The courtroom became completely silent. Richard's attorney immediately stood. Objection. Personal notes are unreliable. Margaret calmly responded, which is why they are being introduced alongside emails written by Mr. Vale himself. She handed another binder to the clerk. The email marked continuity planning appeared on courtroom monitors. The judge read the highlighted sentence silently before looking over his glasses at Richard. Once Seraphina's transition is finalized, Elliot will assume full operational authority without interruption. Richard finally took the witness stand in his own defense. At first he remained composed. Everything I did, he said confidently, was intended to protect both my daughter and our company during a difficult medical crisis. Margaret approached slowly. Mr. Vale, were the documents you presented in the hospital routine administrative forms? Then why did one of them carry the title transfer of controlling voting interests? Richard hesitated for the first time. That was only part of a broader package. Did you tell your daughter that? There wasn't enough time. Ho's decision was that. He didn't answer immediately. Margaret continued. Did you prepare these documents before your daughter's cancer diagnosis was confirmed? Richard looked toward his attorney before quietly saying, some planning had already begun. 4 months earlier. Another pause. Yes, Margaret nodded once. No further questions. Richard looked smaller returning to his seat than he had entering the courtroom that morning. But Margaret wasn't finished. She stood once more and addressed the judge. Your Honor, before closing arguments, we ask permission to introduce one final document executed by the late Margaret Vale. The judge approved. Margaret carefully opened my grandmother's trust amendment and turned directly to the highlighted section. As she began reading the anti-coercion clause aloud, I watched confusion spread across my father's face. Elliot leaned toward him, whispering urgently. My mother looked as though the air had left her lungs. For the first time since this nightmare began, they realized there was something they had never planned for, and as the judge continued reading every carefully written word my grandmother had left behind, I knew the outcome of this case had just changed forever. I will never forget the look on my father's face when the judge finished reading my grandmother's trust amendment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was disbelief. Richard Vale had spent years believing he understood every detail of our family's finances, every contract, every share, every legal advantage. Yet the most important document of all had existed for nearly a decade without him ever realizing it. Elliot leaned toward him, whispering something urgently, but my father didn't answer. He simply stared at Margaret as though the words she had just read couldn't possibly be real. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Richard. Mr. Vale, he said evenly, were you aware of this provision? Richard cleared his throat. No, Your Honor. Did you attempt to obtain signatures from your daughter immediately before major surgery? Richard hesitated. We presented documents. Yes. While she was preparing to undergo anesthesia. Yes. Did you advise her to have independent legal counsel review those documents? Silence. It lasted only a few seconds, but inside a courtroom those seconds feel much longer. Finally Richard answered. There wasn't enough time. The judge nodded slowly without revealing any emotion. That appears to be precisely what concerned your late mother. Richard lowered his eyes for the first time that entire morning. Margaret stood once again. Your Honor, based on the trust's anti-coercion provision, we ask the court to recognize that Richard Vale's authority under the family trust terminated automatically the moment he attempted to pressure Ms. Vale into signing legal documents during her medical crisis. Richard's attorney immediately objected. The trust language requires coercion. My client merely presented paperwork, Margaret didn't argue emotionally. She calmly walked toward the evidence table. Then let's examine what actually happened. She displayed the timeline on a large monitor. The first entry showed the creation of the transfer documents nearly 4 months before my surgery. The second showed executive emails discussing my transition, before my diagnosis had even been confirmed. The third displayed surveillance footage, proving the documents were presented 33 minutes before anesthesia. The fourth showed Deetra Brooks' medical notes documenting my emotional distress. Finally, the last entry showed Richard filing a conservatorship petition only days after I refused to sign. Margaret looked toward the judge. Each individual action might be explained away. Together they reveal a deliberate pattern. The courtroom remained silent as the judge slowly reviewed every exhibit again. Richard's attorney attempted one final defense. Mr. Vale was acting under extraordinary family pressure. He believed he was protecting the business. Before Margaret could respond, the judge spoke first. Protecting the business does not authorize exploiting a vulnerable patient. Those 8 words changed everything. Richard's shoulders visibly dropped. His confidence, which had carried him through weeks of interviews and board meetings, disappeared almost instantly. The judge continued reviewing the conservatorship petition before turning another page. There is also the matter of this filing. He looked directly at Richard. You represented to this court that your daughter was incapable of managing her affairs. Richard nodded cautiously. That was our understanding. The judge lifted another document. Yet only 9 days earlier, internal company emails show you discussing Ms. Vale's ability to resume project leadership if she agreed to transfer voting authority. Richard's attorney quickly flipped through his binder. He hadn't noticed that email had been included among the discovery documents. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If I had been competent enough to negotiate ownership before surgery, I was certainly competent enough to retain my own legal rights afterward. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but stopped before speaking. For the first time in my life, my father had no explanation left. Elliot looked increasingly uncomfortable beside him. Until that moment, he had hidden behind Richard's decisions. But now Margaret turned toward him. Mr. Elliot Vale, she said, would you please take the stand? He glanced nervously at his attorney before complying. Margaret's voice remained calm. Did you know these documents transferred controlling voting interests from your sister to you? Elliot swallowed. Dad handled the legal details. That wasn't my question. Another long pause. Yes. Did you believe your sister knew exactly what she was signing? Elliot looked toward Richard again. I assumed she did. Margaret held up the surveillance, still showing him collecting scattered papers after Richard slammed the folder against the wall. Then why did you tell your father? Immediately afterward, she wasn't supposed to read all of it. Elliot's eyes widened. How? He stopped speaking. Margaret smiled politely. The hospital employee who assisted your father remembered hearing that statement. She provided a sworn affidavit yesterday. I hadn't even known Margaret had found another witness. Neither had Richard. Elliot's face turned pale. He looked down before quietly admitting, Dad said there wouldn't be enough time. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear someone shifting papers near the back row. Richard suddenly stood. This isn't fair, he blurted out. I was trying to save everything my family built. The judge looked at him steadily. Mr. Vale, you had every opportunity to seek transparent legal solutions after your daughter's recovery. Instead, you chose urgency over honesty. That sentence reminded me so much of my grandmother's letter that I almost smiled. After a brief recess, everyone returned for the ruling. I held my breath without realizing it. The judge began carefully, addressing each legal issue separately. First, he denied Richard's petition for conservatorship in its entirety, finding no evidence that I lacked the capacity to manage my affairs. Second, he ruled that the hospital evidence, medical testimony, and documented timeline supported the application of my grandmother's anti-coercion clause. Effective immediately, Richard's authority under the family trust was terminated. Independent trustees would assume administration according to my grandmother's instructions. Third, the court ordered that every corporate action taken using disputed authority during my recovery be reviewed by an independent forensic accounting team. Any decisions made under improper authority would be subject to reversal. Finally, the judge addressed the company's board directly. Succession built upon deception cannot create stable leadership. Those words echoed through the courtroom. Richard slowly sat down without speaking. Elliot stared blankly at the table in front of him. My mother quietly began crying, not dramatic sobs, just silent tears running down her face as the reality finally settled over all of us. My father had spent years trying to control the future. In a single afternoon, he had lost control of nearly everything he had fought to take. As people began leaving the courtroom, reporters rushed toward the hallway, eager to break the story. I remained seated for another moment, unable to move. Margaret gently touched my arm. "It's over," she whispered. I looked toward my father's empty chair. Not quite, because although the court had delivered its ruling, there was still one final chapter left to write, the chapter where every choice made inside that courtroom would reshape the rest of our lives forever. Walking out of the courthouse, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt lighter. There was a difference. Triumph usually comes from defeating someone else. What I felt came from finally putting down a weight I had been carrying for most of my life. Reporters gathered near the courthouse steps before I even reached the front doors. Cameras followed every movement as microphones stretched toward me. "Vale, do you have a statement?" One reporter asked. "Do you consider today's ruling revenge against your family?" Another shouted. I stopped for a moment, looked at the crowd, and answered honestly, "No." They seemed surprised. "Then what is it?" I smiled faintly. "It's accountability." I thanked them politely and walked away before anyone could ask another question. I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. I wasn't going to start again now. Claire hugged me so tightly outside the courthouse that I laughed for the first time in months. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. "We did it." Margaret joined us a few moments later carrying 3 heavy document boxes. "Actually," she said with a smile, "your grandmother deserves a great deal of the credit." I looked at the boxes and nodded. She always seems to know what to say, even now. Margaret handed me a sealed envelope I had never seen before. She instructed me to give you this only after everything was resolved. I looked at the familiar handwriting on the front. For Seraphina, after peace returns. I didn't open it immediately. Somehow it felt right to wait until I was home. The following week brought more change than I could have imagined. The company's board held an emergency meeting under the supervision of the independent trustees. After reviewing the court's findings and the preliminary forensic report, they voted unanimously to remove Elliot from every executive leadership position. Several board members publicly admitted they had approved earlier decisions because Richard had assured them I had already consented. Benjamin Ortiz personally apologized during the meeting. "We failed to verify the truth," he said. "That mistake won't happen again." Richard resigned before the board could formally remove him. According to people who attended the meeting, he never looked at anyone while reading his resignation letter. The man who had spent decades believing he controlled every room he entered quietly walked out, carrying a single cardboard box. There were no speeches, no applause, just silence. Elliot tried to remain involved for another week, insisting he had simply trusted our father. But trust wasn't enough to erase responsibility. When investigators finished reviewing company emails, they confirmed he had participated in several meetings where my authority was intentionally misrepresented. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he lost every leadership role he had expected to inherit. Ironically, he ended up applying for management jobs outside the company for the first time in his life. My mother called almost every day after the hearing. At first I didn't answer. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready either. Eventually I agreed to meet her at a small cafe my grandmother used to love. She looked older than I remembered, as though the past few weeks had stolen years from her face. We sat in silence for several minutes before she finally spoke. "I kept telling myself Richard knew what was best," she said quietly. "It was easier than admitting I was watching him hurt you." I listened without interrupting. I should have stopped him in that hospital room. Tears filled her eyes. "Instead, I asked you to sign." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry, Seraphina. It wasn't a perfect apology. It couldn't erase decades of favoritism or the pain of that morning before surgery. But unlike every apology that had come before, this one didn't include excuses." I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I forgive you," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't put things back the way they were." She nodded slowly. "I know, that was enough." We left the cafe separately, both understanding that rebuilding trust would take far longer than speaking those two simple words. A month later, the board offered me the position of Chief Executive Officer. The proposal surprised almost everyone except Margaret. "Your grandmother expected this," she said with a knowing smile. I thought about it carefully before making my decision. For years I had believed becoming CEO would prove I was finally good enough. But standing in that courtroom had changed something inside me. I realized I no longer needed my father's approval, or his company, to measure my worth. I declined the offer. Instead, I agreed to remain on the board as an independent director while returning to what I loved most: architecture. Designing buildings had always made me happier than managing boardroom politics. For the first time, I chose my future because it was right for me, not because I was trying to earn someone else's acceptance. A few weeks after everything settled, I finally opened my grandmother's last letter. Her handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. "My dear Seraphina, if you're reading this, then you chose your voice over your fear. I'm proud of you. Families sometimes confuse love with ownership. Never let anyone, including those who share your name, convince you that your life belongs to them. Real love gives freedom. It never demands surrender. Build something beautiful. That's always been your gift." I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the faded photograph of us planting oak trees together. Soon afterward, I finally fulfilled the dream we had once talked about. On the land she left me, I began designing a small wellness center for cancer patients and their families. A peaceful place where people facing frightening diagnoses could rest, receive support, and remember they weren't alone. Every tree we planted years earlier still stood there, stronger than before. Sometimes I visit the property early in the morning before construction crews arrive. I sit beneath those trees, drink my coffee, and think about how close I came to signing away far more than land or company shares. I almost signed away my own voice. Looking back, cancer wasn't the experience that changed my life the most. The moment I quietly pushed that folder back across my hospital bed and said, "No," changed everything. My father believed power came from controlling people. My grandmother understood that real strength comes from protecting yourself without becoming someone you no longer recognize. That's the lesson I carry with me now. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes the smallest word can completely change the rest of your life. So let me ask you this. If the people you loved most placed those papers in front of you 30 minutes before surgery, would you have had the courage to say no? After everything settled, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it finally became honest. My recovery continued one quiet day at a time, and every follow-up appointment brought better news than the last. The scars from surgery slowly faded, but the lessons never did. Construction on the wellness center moved forward, exactly as my grandmother and I had once imagined, surrounded by the oak trees we planted together years ago. Every time I visited the site, I saw families sitting together, volunteers preparing meals, and patients walking through gardens designed to offer peace instead of fear. That place became the most meaningful project of my entire career because it wasn't built to impress investors or win awards. It was built to remind people that hope deserves a home. My relationship with my mother remained cautious, but genuine. We met for coffee once every few weeks, never pretending the past hadn't happened, yet never allowing it to define every conversation either. Trust returned slowly, one honest choice at a time. Richard never contacted me again after mailing a brief letter accepting responsibility for his decisions. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer without anger. Some chapters don't need another conversation to end. Elliot eventually found work at another company where, for the first time, he had to earn promotions without anyone clearing the path ahead of him. I sincerely hoped he would learn something from that experience, even if we never spoke again. As for me, I returned to designing buildings with a different purpose than before. I no longer worked to prove my value to anyone. I worked because creating something meaningful made me happy. Sometimes people ask whether I regret refusing to sign those papers that morning in the hospital. My answer is always the same. If I had signed them, I might have kept my family's approval for a little while, but I would have lost my own self-respect for the rest of my life. Looking back, the greatest inheritance my grandmother ever left me wasn't the land, the trust, or the legal protection that saved my future. It was the courage to believe that saying no to manipulation is not an act of selfishness. It's an act of self-respect. And maybe that's the quietest form of karma there is. So if you've ever been pressured to choose someone else's happiness over your own peace, I'd love to know. What would you have done if you had been sitting in that hospital bed? Richard never came to the opening ceremony of the wellness center, but someone later told me he had driven past the property that morning. He never got out of the car. He simply parked across the road for a few minutes, watched families gathering beneath the oak trees my grandmother and I had planted years before, and then quietly drove away. I don't know what he was thinking, and honestly, I don't need to. Some people spend their entire lives chasing control only to discover, far too late, that the things worth having can never be owned. Respect has to be earned. Trust has to be protected. Love has to be given freely. Elliot sent me one email nearly 6 months after the court ruling. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for money or another chance inside the company. It contained only 3 short sentences. I finally understand why Grandma trusted you more than me. For the first time in my life, nobody knows my last name, and everything I accomplish depends on me. I should have learned that years ago. I read the message twice before quietly deleting it. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need an apology to keep moving forward. His journey was finally his own, just as mine had become mine. A few weeks later, my mother invited me to her house. When I arrived, she placed an old photo album on the kitchen table. It was filled with pictures I had never seen before. There were photographs of me helping my grandmother plant flowers, sketching buildings on the living room floor as a little girl, laughing while covered in paint during elementary school art projects, and standing proudly beside my first architectural model. Your father never liked displaying these, she admitted quietly. He always wanted family pictures that included everyone. She gently pushed the album toward me. But these remind me of who you were before we expected you to carry everyone else's burdens. I slowly turned each page until I reached the final photograph. It showed my grandmother smiling beside those tiny oak trees, both of us covered in dirt. Neither of us looking at the camera because we were laughing too hard. Written beneath the picture, in her familiar handwriting, were the words "Strong roots don't grow because life is easy. They grow because they refuse to stop reaching for the light." I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. My mother quietly reached across the table and held my hand. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Some moments don't need words. They only need honesty. Nearly a year after the trial, construction on the wellness center was finally complete. Patients and their families filled the gardens. Children laughed beneath the trees. Volunteers welcomed new visitors through doors designed to feel more like home than a hospital. And every room carried a small bronze plaque with my grandmother's favorite sentence engraved beneath it. Love never demands urgency when honesty can wait. During the dedication ceremony, people expected me to talk about the lawsuit or the company. Instead, I spoke about courage. I told them that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes courage is a woman lying in a hospital bed, frightened about surgery, quietly pushing a stack of papers away and saying one simple word. No. That single word didn't destroy my family, their choices did. My refusal simply allowed the truth to be seen. Today, when I walk through the gardens and see families comforting one another, I no longer think about everything I almost lost. I think about everything I was finally free to build. My grandmother was right all along. The greatest inheritance was never land, money, or company shares. It was the ability to recognize the difference between love and control, and having the courage to choose yourself when the people closest to you refuse to. So now I want to leave you with one final question. If the people you trusted most asked you to sacrifice your future for their comfort, would you still call it love? Or would you finally find the strength to say no?